Ashley Hunter stared at the pregnancy test for a long time, as if she couldn't believe her eyes. 2 distinct stripes. No doubt about it. Her heart was beating so hard it felt like it was about to jump out of her chest. It's been 32 years, and she still wasn't ready for this moment. But now it was happening. She set the test aside and pressed her palms against her still flat stomach. Somewhere in there, inside her, a new life was budding. Her and James's baby. The thought made her smile. James, her husband, was in Alaska now, working in the oil field. He'd been working for North Star Energy for 5 years, 3 of them on a rotational basis, 6 months in the field, 6 months at home. Now was his work period. 2 more months, and he'd be home. But now everything was different. Ashley couldn't wait. She wanted to see the look on his face when he learned the news. She wanted to share that joy with him now, not via text or video call. She made the decision almost instantly to surprise him and fly to Alaska to see him. Their marriage had always been strong despite the long separations. When they met 6 years ago at a charity race, James was working as an engineer for a local construction company. But then came an offer from North Star Energy with a salary that was almost double his previous income. And while at first he just had to travel a lot on business trips, 3 years ago the terms changed. 6 months in Alaska, 6 months at home in Seattle. For many couples, that schedule would be a challenge, but they managed. Evening phone calls, weekend video chats. James rarely flew home during his shift. The trip took almost 24 hours with all the connections, and airfare was expensive. And when he came home for his 6 months, it was always like a second honeymoon. Ashley started packing her suitcase, mentally planning the trip. Need to take time off work. The hospital where she worked as a nurse luckily had a week of unused vacations saved up. Book a hotel room. And most importantly, find out the exact address where James now lived. The company provided housing for its shift workers, usually office apartments or trailers in a special town near the field. James had never specified his exact address, saying, "All these trailers are the same, boring and impersonal." She didn't want to call him directly. It would lose the element of surprise. 3 days later, Ashley was already treading the cold Alaskan soil. It had taken her 2 flights and almost 18 hours to get to the Fairbanks airport, and from there it had taken her another 3 hours by bus to the town of Prado Bay, where North Star Energy was located. The plan was simple. Check into a local hotel, and then go to the company office and ask for information on where the shift workers were housed. After checking into a small but cozy room, Ashley went to the company's administrative building. In the small, functional lobby, she was greeted by a middle-aged woman behind the reception desk. "What can I do for you?" she asked with a professional smile. "Good afternoon." Ashley tried to sound confident. "My husband, James Hunter, has some important documents to deliver. He works for you on a rotational basis. Could you tell me where I could find him?" The woman looked at her with mild bewilderment. "Usually we just send correspondence through the office," she said. "I can take your papers and give them to Mr. Hunter when he comes in from the field." Ashley shook her head. "No, this is very personal. I'm his wife, flown in from afar. I really need to see him in person." The woman hesitated, but then nodded and started looking something up on the computer. "James Hunter," she mumbled. "Yes, he works on Station B. He's supposed to be on shift now, and he'll be back in the housing unit in about 2 hours. Housing Unit 5, room 412. Ashley thanked the woman and left the building. The plan was starting to work. She decided to spend the next 2 hours exploring the township. It was a strange place, industrial buildings interspersed with residential units, all functional, no frills. All around was a vast snowy plain, harsh but beautiful in its own way. She went into the only Northern Light supermarket in the whole town to buy something for dinner. She wanted to cook something special for their reunion, though she didn't even know if the kitchen in James's room had any dishes. Ashley wandered between the shelves, choosing foods that didn't require complicated preparation. She imagined how surprised James would be when he saw her, how they would celebrate the news of the baby. It was in the beverage department that she saw him. At first, Ashley thought she was imagining things, but no, it was definitely James. Her husband, wearing a work jacket with the North Star Energy logo on it, stood at the beer rack, picking out a package. Ashley's heart jumped. What a coincidence. Shouldn't he be on shift? She was about to call out to him when a woman approached James. A pretty brunette in her mid-30s put her hand on James's shoulder and said something in his ear. He turned and smiled at her so warmly, so familiarly. It was exactly how he smiled at Ashley. Then he put his arm around the woman's waist and kissed her. At that moment, Ashley's world seemed to stop. A strange ringing in her ears drowned out all the sounds of the supermarket. She instinctively retreated behind a shelving unit and continued to watch, unable to take her eyes off what was happening. And then the situation got even worse. Ashley noticed the baby cart they were rolling with them, where sat a toddler of about 2 years old, with dark hair like his mother's and a smile that bore a striking resemblance to James's. "Daddy, Daddy," the toddler exclaimed happily, holding out his arms. James picked the boy up in his arms and tossed him around, causing the child to laugh enthusiastically. "How are you doing, buddy?" he said in that familiar voice of his. "Did you pick out anything good to eat?" Ashley leaned against the shelving unit, feeling her legs give out. James had a different family, another woman, a child, a boy who called him Daddy and was about 2 years old. That meant this relationship had already started during their marriage, when James started working shift work. As if in a haze, she left her grocery cart right there in the aisle and headed for the store exit on unsteady legs. Needed to get out, get a breath of fresh air, figure out what was going on. But instead, she stopped at the exit and waited. She needed to know the truth to the end, to see where they lived, to understand the extent of the lies her husband had been living all these years. About 15 minutes later, the family walked out of the supermarket. James was carrying several bags of groceries. The woman was rolling a cart with a baby. They looked like the perfect happy family. It was like her and James's marriage didn't exist at all. Ashley followed them at a safe distance. They were walking. Obviously, they didn't live far away. 10 minutes later, they came to one of the housing blocks, but not the faceless dormitory she'd been told about. This was a better building, with separate apartments for the families of the permanent employees. Ashley hid around the corner of a neighboring building and watched James pull out his keys and open the front door, as the woman takes the baby inside. As James kisses her before entering the apartment with the packages. This wasn't temporary office housing for shift workers. This was a real family apartment that James had clearly lived in for more than a year, an apartment Ashley knew nothing about. She stood there, shivering with cold and shock until it got dark. Lights came on in the windows. Through the unshaded living room window, she could see them eating dinner. James feeding the baby from a spoon, making funny grimaces to get him to open his mouth. How this woman, her rival, whose name she didn't even know, laughed as she watched them. The realization of the extent of the deception was staggering. Not just an affair on the side, not just a casual hookup, a full-blown second life, a second family, a son, an apartment, and all those 6 months he'd spent on watch. He'd just lived here, with them. And she, Ashley, naively waited for him, counting the days until his return, not realizing she was sharing her husband with another woman. And now there was a child. Their child growing inside her. What would she tell him when he was born? How will she explain that his father leads a double life? Suddenly, she felt nauseous. Ashley barely made it around the corner of the building before she threw up, whether it was from the pregnancy or the realization of betrayal, or both. The Arctic cold penetrated her jacket, which wasn't designed for such low temperatures, but she barely felt it, stunned by her discovery. She wiped her mouth with her handkerchief and straightened up. 1,000 thoughts swarmed in her head. What to do? Go right now, knock on the door, make a scene? Or leave quietly, file for divorce and try to forget? Pretend she didn't know anything and go on with her life as before? But she knew none of those options would work. This betrayal was too deep, too painful. James hadn't just cheated on her. He had created an entire parallel life. He had a son Ashley didn't even know she had. How many years had he lied to her? All those 3 years he'd been working shift work? Suddenly she realized she couldn't stand in the cold any longer. Her lips turned blue and her fingers went numb. Ashley cast one last glance at the glowing windows of the apartment where her husband's second family lived and walked slowly toward her hotel. She needed to ponder her next move. decide what to do with this knowledge, and what to do with her pregnancy. As she entered her room, she turned the heater on full blast, but the internal cold seemed unable to warm up any heater. Ashley collapsed onto the bed, and for the first time all day allowed herself to cry. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she didn't make a sound, as if she was still afraid someone would hear and know of her pain. After an hour, she forced herself to get up and take a hot shower. The mechanical action helped her not to think. She washed her hair, brushed her teeth thoroughly, even applied moisturizer to her face, all as if it was a normal evening, and not the day her world had collapsed. Walking out of the bathroom, Ashley saw 3 missed calls from James on her phone screen. The time was approaching midnight. He was probably calling to say goodnight to her like he did every night. Another part of their usual ritual, which was suddenly completely false. Her finger hovered over the call button. Should I call him? Shout? Accuse him? Or talk calmly, as if nothing had happened? Buy time to decide what to do next. Ashley put the phone away. No, she wasn't ready to talk to him right now. She needed to think things through first, gather more information, understand what her options are, and most importantly, what it all meant for the baby she was carrying. She crawled under the covers, knowing she was unlikely to get much sleep. Outside the window, the wind howled, throwing snowflakes against the glass. Ashley stared up at the ceiling, going over various scenarios in her mind. What if tomorrow she just knocked on that apartment door? What if she just disappeared from his life and never contacted him again? What if she pretended she didn't know anything? Each of these options seemed both impossible and the only true option at the same time. At some point, between thoughts of cheating, lying, and a future child, she did fall into a troubled sleep. Ashley woke up with a headache and nausea. She didn't immediately realize where she was. The hotel room seemed so foreign and uncomfortable. And then the memories came flooding back. James, a woman, a child, a second family. She reached for her phone. 7 missed calls from her husband and several texts. Where are you? Why aren't you answering? Is everything okay? The last message had come just 15 minutes ago. Ashley, if you don't answer by tonight, I'll be calling the hospital. I'm worried. He's worried. The thought made her laugh bitterly. A man living a double life is worried about her. The one who had been deceiving her for years is feigning concern. The nausea intensified, and Ashley barely made it to the bathroom in time. She felt a little better physically after her shower, but the emotional storm inside wouldn't subside. The baby. She put her hand on her stomach. What to do about this pregnancy now? She'd always wanted children, but not like this. Not in a family built on lies. Ashley shook her head resolutely. No, it wasn't the baby's fault in any way. No matter what happened to their marriage, she would keep this pregnancy. But first, she needed to deal with James. She got dressed and left the hotel. The day was overcast and cold, but she needed to take a walk, clear her head. At the same time, she decided to gather more information about her husband's second family. At the nearest cafe, Ashley ordered a herbal tea, coffee was now off limits, and opened her laptop. The first thing she did was check social media. James only had a work LinkedIn profile where he listed himself as married to her. But maybe his second wife had accounts? Ashley searched Facebook for women with the last name Hunter living in Prado Bay. Nothing. Perhaps they're not officially married? Or does she have a different last name? Without a first name, the search was useless. Going to the North Star Energy website, she found the employee section, several group photos from corporate events. In one of them, she noticed James standing next to the same woman. The caption under the photo read, Site B engineering team with their families at the summer picnic. Standing next to James was Melanie Wilson with her son Ethan. So Melanie Wilson, not Hunter, and the boy's name is Ethan. Ashley felt oddly relieved that she recognized their names. It made the situation seem more real, less like a nightmare. Further searching revealed that Melanie worked as a nurse at the local clinic at the oil complex. So she and James had most likely met here at work. The information she'd found only made the pain worse. This wasn't a casual fling. This was a serious long-term relationship. A home. A child. Ashley closed the laptop and took a deep breath. It was time to make a decision. Go home and file for divorce? Or face James face to face? She chose the latter. She wanted answers. She deserved the truth after so many years of deception. Ashley pulled out her phone and dialed a message. I'm in Prado Bay. We need to talk. Meet me at the Northern Lights Motel, room 27 at 6 p.m. The reply came almost instantly. What? You're in Alaska? Why? What happened? She didn't bother to answer. Let her suffer the unknown as she had all these years. Ashley checked into the motel, which was on the edge of town, far enough away from the apartment complex where James's second family lived. She didn't want to meet at her hotel, much less at their house. Neutral territory seemed the best option for a conversation that could go either way. By 6 o'clock, she was already in her room. Simple furnishings, a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a small television. Ashley sat on the edge of the bed, nervously rubbing the edge of the bedspread. She had rehearsed the phrases she would say to James, but they were all flying out of her head. At 6 sharp, there was a knock on the door. Ashley took a deep breath and went to open it. James looked worried and confused. His blonde hair was disheveled as if he had run his hand through it many times, a gesture she had always found cute. Now he was just annoying. Ashley? What's going on? Why are you here? Did something happen at home? The questions came in a hail of questions as soon as he stepped through the door. She stepped back silently, letting him enter the room, then closed the door. Sit down, she said quietly, pointing to a chair. You're scaring me. James sat down, keeping his eyes on her. What's wrong? I know about Melanie and Ethan. The words came easier than she expected. James froze. His face went blank for a moment, as if someone had pressed the pause button. Then horror flashed in his eyes, and he tried to say something, but all he got out was a wheeze. How? He finally squeezed out. I saw you yesterday at the supermarket, by chance. I flew here to tell you the good news. She put her hand on her stomach. I'm pregnant, James. We're having a baby. His face showed a range of emotions. Shock, joy, confusion, fear. Pregnant, but, he stammered. Ashley, I can explain. You can? Her voice turned cold. Can you explain why you have a child with another woman? Why you live with her when you tell me you work in the oil field? Why you've been lying to me for years? James lowered his head. I didn't plan this, he said quietly. It just happened. These things don't just happen, James. Ashley felt her calmness cracking at the seams. You deliberately created a second family. He shuddered. I met Melanie 3 years ago when I started working shifts, he began. At first we were just friends. Then he stopped talking. And then you decided that one family wasn't enough for you? Ashley couldn't contain her sarcasm. That one more set of wife and kid wouldn't hurt? I'm confused. James ran a hand through his hair. I thought it was just a fling on the side, nothing serious. But then Melanie got pregnant, and I couldn't just leave her. You could have told me the truth, Ashley exclaimed. We could have gotten a divorce, and you could have lived with your new family without lying to all of us. I didn't want to lose you. James's voice shook. I love you, Ashley. Don't you dare say you love me. She felt tears come to her eyes. People don't lie to the ones they love. They don't betray them for years. What does Melanie think about all this? Ashley asked after a pause. Does she know you're married? James shook his head. She thinks I'm divorced and that you're my ex-wife who I'm on friendly terms with. Jesus! Ashley covered her face with her hands. You lied to both of us. Ashley, please! James stood up and tried to walk over to her. Let's talk calmly. I know I screwed up, but... Screwed up? She stepped back. That's an understatement. You ruined our life. They stood across from each other, separated not only by physical space, but by the chasm of lies that had grown over the years. And the baby? James asked quietly. Our baby. Will you keep it? Ashley instinctively covered her stomach with her hand. It's none of your business, she cut him off. You lost your say in my life the moment you decided to start a second family. Please, let's at least talk about this, James pleaded. I know what I did was awful, but we can find a way out. What way out, James? Ashley grinned bitterly. Are you going to toss yourself between 2 families? Or are you suggesting that Melanie and I set up a visitation schedule? He was silent, clearly not having an answer. You know what the worst part is? Ashley continued. You haven't even apologized. You just made excuses. I apologize, James said hastily. I'm sorry, Ashley. Yeah, it's too late, she interrupted. Too late for an apology. James sank back into his chair and covered his face with his hands. What are you going to do? He asked in a muffled voice. Divorce you, Ashley replied firmly. And Melanie deserves to know the truth. James's head came up sharply. No, please don't tell her. There was real fear in his voice. She wouldn't stand for it. Ethan just started kindergarten. She's got health problems. Oh, so now you care about her feelings? Ashley snarked. After lying to her for years? You don't understand. James lowered his voice. This isn't just about our relationship. There's something else. What else? Ashley asked tiredly. Another family in Texas? Financial matters, James answered evasively. I used some schemes to get extra payments from the company, family allowances, tax deductions. Ashley stared at him in disbelief. You're a con man too? I did it for us, James exclaimed. For both families. That money helped us buy a house in Seattle, helped Melanie with her medical bills. You used the stolen money to finance your double life? Ashley couldn't believe her ears. And you think that's an excuse? If the truth comes out, I won't just get fired, James said quietly. I could go to jail. Ashley, think about the baby. Our baby. Do you want his father in jail? Ashley felt like she couldn't breathe. It was like the walls of the room were closing in around her. Get out, she whispered. What? Get out, Ashley screamed. I don't want to see you anymore. I need to think. James slowly stood up. Please don't do anything we'll both regret, he said quietly. Let's meet tomorrow when you've calmed down. We can work things out. Go away, Ashley repeated, turning away to the window. She heard his footsteps, the creak of the door, and finally, there was silence. Ashley collapsed onto the bed and burst into tears. Her whole body shook with sobs, tears flowing uncontrollably. She didn't know how long it was before she was able to stop. Gradually coming to her senses, Ashley began to analyze the situation more soberly. Blackmail. That's what James was trying to do. Used his financial shenanigans as leverage to keep her quiet. And he used the baby too. That was the last straw. She wasn't going to let him manipulate her. Ashley pulled out her phone and started looking for return tickets to Seattle. The sooner she got out of here, the better. But first, Melanie needed to know the truth. The woman deserved it as much as she did. Ashley hesitated. Should she write to her? No. Such things couldn't be communicated in a message. Call her? Without personal contact, Melanie might just not believe her. Meet in person? That would be hard for both of them, but probably the fairest thing to do. Her musings were interrupted by a sound outside the door, a strange rustle, then a heavy thud, as if something or someone had fallen to the hallway floor. Ashley froze. Had James returned, or was it someone else? She went to the door and listened. Silence, then a rustle again. James? She called out. Is that you? There was no answer. Ashley opened the door cautiously and saw something that made her scream in horror. 200 kilometers from Prado Bay, Detective Robert Taylor was finishing up paperwork in his office in Fairbanks. A tall man of 48 with streaked dark hair and attentive brown eyes, he was known for being methodical and persistent in solving cases. The call caught him just as he was about to leave for home. Detective Taylor, he answered. Sir, this is Officer Jenkins from Prado Bay. The voice on the phone sounded tense. We have a situation at the Northern Lights Motel. Possible homicide. We need a senior investigator. Taylor sighed. Friday night, and he had a long drive north. What do you know? He asked, pulling out his car keys. A woman, presumably a tourist, found a body in a motel hallway. Lots of blood. We've cordoned off the scene and are waiting for you. I'm on my way, Taylor replied briefly. I'll be there in 3 hours. Nobody in or out of the motel. He hung up the phone and reached for his jacket. Well, the vacation was delayed. Murder was rare in Prado Bay, a small industrial town that lived a quiet life, and violent crime was rare. Whatever had happened at this motel was clearly out of the ordinary. 3 hours later, Taylor parked the squad car outside the Northern Lights Motel. Police tape was stretched around the building, and several patrol cars stood with their blinkers on. Officer Jenkins, a young guy with a nervous look, was waiting for him at the entrance. "What do we got, Jenkins?" Taylor asked, putting on his gloves. Victim is male, 35 to 40 years old, multiple stab wounds. Suspected murder weapon is a kitchen knife found near the body. ID in his wallet identifies him as James Hunter, an employee of North Star Energy. The body was discovered by a motel guest, Ashley Hunter, presumably his wife. Taylor raised an eyebrow. "Wife? Interesting. Where is she now?" "In room 27 with Officer Riley. She's in shock but physically unhurt." "Any witnesses?" "No one's seen or heard anything yet. No security cameras in the hallways, just in the parking lot." Taylor nodded and made his way inside. James Hunter's body lay in the hallway in front of number 27, already surrounded by markers and being photographed by forensics. The detective squatted down, studying the crime scene. Multiple stab wounds to the chest and abdomen. A pool of blood under the body. A knife with a wooden handle next to it. A common kitchen knife, the kind you'd find in any home. "Time of death?" Taylor asked the medical examiner, a young woman of Asian appearance who was examining the body. "Tentatively between 7 and 8 p.m., she replied. "I'll be more specific after the autopsy." Taylor looked at his watch. It was almost 11 now. The murder was relatively recent. "All the wounds were inflicted from the front," she continued. "It looks like the attacker was facing the victim. There were no signs of struggle on the hands, which could indicate that the victim knew his attacker and was not expecting an attack." The detective got up and headed to room 27. There, a woman in her 30s sat on the edge of the bed, pale, eyes reddened with tears. Ashley Hunter. Officer Riley stood at the window watching her. "Mrs. Hunter?" Taylor showed his badge. "I'm Detective Robert Taylor. I'm sorry for your loss." The woman looked up at him with a blank stare. "Can you tell me what happened?" the detective asked softly. "I don't know," she replied quietly. "We talked, he left, and then I heard a noise in the hallway. I opened the door and..." Her voice shook. "He was lying there, covered in blood. I screamed. Someone from the other rooms called the police." "When was the last time you saw your husband alive?" "Around 7 p.m. We had a fight. He left." "What was the argument about?" Taylor asked, watching her reaction carefully. Ashley lowered her eyes. "It's personal. Mrs. Hunter, your husband was murdered. There's nothing more personal than that. I need to know anything that can help me find the killer." She took a deep breath. "I found out that James has other family here in Prado Bay. A woman named Melanie Wilson and their son Ethan. I flew here to inform my husband of my pregnancy and happened to see them together at the supermarket. We met today to talk about it." Taylor raised an eyebrow. The case was getting complicated. "So your husband had a double life?" Ashley nodded. "He'd been working shifts half the year here, half the year at home in Seattle. Only it turned out that during the 3 years he was supposedly at work, he was living with a second family." "Were you angry with him?" the detective asked me directly. "Of course I was mad at him," Ashley exclaimed. "But I didn't kill him, if that's what you mean." "I'm just gathering information at the moment," Taylor replied calmly. "What else were you discussing?" Ashley hesitated. James admitted that he'd been using some kind of financial scheme at the company, getting double payments or something like that. He was afraid he might go to jail if the truth came out. Taylor made a note in his notebook. Motives multiplied. Jealousy, anger, money. "Do you know where Melanie Wilson is right now?" "I have no idea," Ashley shook her head. "Probably at home with the baby. She lives in an apartment complex for the families of North Star employees." "Were you planning on meeting her?" "Yeah. Thought about it," Ashley admitted. "She deserves to know the truth as much as I do." Taylor nodded and closed his notebook. "Mrs. Hunter, I need you to stay in town for the duration of the investigation." "Where are you staying?" "At the Polaris Hotel," she replied. "But I don't want to go back there alone. Can I stay here?" "I'm afraid this is a crime scene," the detective said softly. "Officer Riley will escort you to the hotel and stay with you tonight. We'll need your official statement at the station tomorrow." Ashley nodded idly. Her eyes were empty, as if all emotion had burned out, leaving only a shell. Leaving the room, Taylor looked over the body and the crime scene again. Something didn't add up in this picture. A stabbing is a passionate, emotional crime, usually committed in a fit of rage, without planning. But where's the attacker? If it was Ashley, she'd have blood on her. And if it was someone else, how did he get into the motel and then where did he disappear to? And where is Melanie Wilson in all this? Did she know about James's double life? Did she find out today? The morning was cold and overcast, as if nature itself reflected the gloom of what was happening. Detective Robert Taylor stood at the window of his temporary office at the Prado Bay police station, looking out at the gray sky and the occasional snowflake dancing in the wind. Coffee was steaming on the desk, his fourth cup since the workday began. The whiteboard hanging on the wall was mottled with photos, notes, and red threads connecting key elements of the case. In the center was a photo of James Hunter, and around him were the two women who considered themselves his only life partners. Taylor rubbed his eyes. It had been a rough night. After finding the body, he'd spent several hours at the crime scene, then went to Melanie Wilson's house. Patrolmen found the woman at home with her child, completely unaware of what had happened. The news of James's death came as a shock to her. Taylor had seen her world literally crumble before his eyes. But even more shocking to her was the news that Ashley existed and that James was officially married to another woman. The door to the office opened, interrupting the detective's musings. A young Officer Jenkins entered with a folder in his hands. "CCTV results, sir," he said, placing the folder on the desk. "And the coroner's report." Taylor nodded, returning to the table. "What have we got?" "The parking lot cameras caught Melanie Wilson's car entering the motel parking lot at 18:30, Jenkins reported. "That's about a half hour before the alleged murder. She left the property at 19:20. The detective opened the folder. Indeed, the printed surveillance footage clearly showed a blue sedan belonging to Melanie. And there she is, getting out of the car, looking around nervously, heading toward the motel entrance. Her face was partially obscured by the hood, but identification was certain. What about the M.E. quote? S report? Death occurred between 9 o'clock and 9:30 as a result of multiple stab wounds. 12 stab wounds in all, mostly to the chest and abdomen. The murder weapon was a kitchen knife with a 9-centimeter blade found at the scene. Prints were found on the handle, which is where the stabbing is now. Anything else of interest? Yes, the marks of violence indicate that the attacker was in a state of extreme emotional agitation. The blows were delivered with great force, some after the victim was dead. This is consistent with a crime committed in a fit of rage, not a premeditated murder. Taylor tapped his fingers on the table thoughtfully. "And do we have the results of the interviews with the other motel guests yet?" "Yes, sir." Several people heard a loud conversation coming from room 27 at approximately 18 hours and 40 minutes. Someone heard a man and a woman arguing, although they couldn't make out the words. Then a guest in room 25 heard someone walking down the hallway toward the exit, presumably James Hunter. About 20 minutes later, the same witness heard footsteps returning to the corridor, then muffled voices and the sound of a struggle. "Interesting," Taylor stretched out. "It fits with the theory that Melanie came to the motel, waited for James to leave Ashley's, and then attacked him." "But why wait?" Jenkins asked. "Why not attack right away?" "Perhaps she wanted to overhear their conversation," suggested the detective. To see what the husband would say to his official wife. Taylor returned to the board, studying the photos. Ashley Hunter was a nurse from Seattle, 32 years old, pregnant with James's child. Melanie Wilson is a nurse at a local clinic, 30 years old, mother of James's 2-year-old son. Both victims of his double life, both had a motive for murder. "When are we scheduled to interview Ashley Hunter?" 30 minutes, sir, and Melanie Wilson at 1300 hours. "Okay." Taylor took a sip of his cold coffee. "What about Hunter's finances? Anything on his alleged frauds?" "We've requested the data from North Star Energy. Their finance department's cooperating, but they say a full audit will take time." "Tell them it's a murder case," Taylor said dryly. "That should speed things up." At that moment there was a knock, and another officer entered the office with new documents. "Sir, we have the results on the prints from the knife," he said. "They belong to Melanie Wilson." Taylor nodded. The evidence was adding up to a pretty clear picture, but he wasn't jumping to conclusions. He'd learned over the years that the obvious answers weren't always the right ones. "Let's bring Mrs. Hunter in," he said. Ashley entered the interrogation room at exactly the appointed time. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes and pale skin. Taylor noted that she was wearing the same clothes as yesterday. Obviously, she hadn't had any change of clothes with her. "Thank you for coming in, Mrs. Hunter," the detective began. "How are you feeling?" "Like someone who just lost her husband and simultaneously found out that his entire marriage was a lie," she replied with a bitter chuckle. "I'm also pregnant, nauseous in the morning, and I'm in a foreign city thousands of kilometers away from home. How do you think I feel?" Taylor nodded understandingly. "I need to ask you a few more questions. Yesterday you said you were planning to tell your husband that you were pregnant. Did he know about it before you arrived?" Ashley shook her head. "No. I wanted to tell him in person, to surprise him." She grinned bitterly. "It was a surprise, but not the one I'd hoped for. And I take it you discovered his second family by accident?" "Yeah. I saw them at the supermarket. James, Melanie, and their baby are the perfect little family," Ashley gulped. "I followed them home, and that's when I realized it wasn't just an affair. It's a full-fledged second life." "What did you do after James left your room last night?" "I cried," she answered simply. "Then I started looking for tickets home. I wanted to leave as soon as possible." "You didn't leave the room?" "No." Ashley looked him straight in the eye. "I only opened the door when I heard a noise in the hallway." Taylor studied her face, looking for signs of lying. But Ashley looked sincere, crushed by grief, yes, but not guilty. Sure, he'd seen enough masterful liars in his career, but his gut told him this woman was telling the truth. "What do you know about Melanie Wilson?" "Nothing, except that she's a nurse and the mother of my husband's child," Ashley replied. "I looked her up online, but I wasn't going to meet her. At least not right away." "What do you think about the financial scams your husband told you about?" Ashley sighed. "I don't know the details. He said he was getting some extra payments from the company by using his double life. I was too upset about his cheating to go into details." Taylor asked a few more questions, but didn't learn anything substantially new. After Ashley left, he sat for a while, mulling over the situation. By all accounts, she was indeed the victim in this story. But then, who was the killer? Kevin Morgan, James's co-worker and friend, was called in for questioning next, a tall, middle-aged man with a tired look and nervous movements. "Mr. Morgan, what can you tell us about James Hunter?" "We worked together for 3 years, Kevin began. "A good engineer, always did his job well, but—" He hesitated. "But?" Taylor nudged him. "James was living a double life." Kevin sighed. "I was the only one who knew about it. We had drinks together sometimes, and one day he blurted it out. I didn't believe it at first, but then he showed me the pictures. 2 families on opposite sides of the country." "And how did he explain it?" "He said he loved both women. Couldn't decide between them. When Melanie got pregnant, he decided to just carry on as he was. 6 months with one wife, 6 months with the other." "And did you know about his financial shenanigans?" Kevin visibly tensed. "What do you mean?" James admitted to Ashley that he'd been using some scheme to get more money from the company. "Yeah." Kevin lowered his gaze. "Yeah, I knew. He was double billing Social Security benefits, tax deductions, used his position as an IT guy to manipulate the data in the company system. I told him it was dangerous, but he thought he was smarter than everyone else." "And no one at the company noticed? Everyone thought he was just a very good systems specialist who simplified some processes," Kevin explained. "In fact, those simplifications allowed him to get double paychecks. He even joked that the company was actually sponsoring his double life." Taylor made a note in his notebook. "Was there anyone else who might have known about his double life, or about the shenanigans?" Kevin hesitated for a moment. "I don't think so. James was very careful. Although..." He hesitated again. "What?" "He'd been jumpy the last few weeks. Said someone in finance started asking questions. He was afraid his scheme would be exposed. It was an interesting lead." Taylor wrote down this information and let Kevin go, thanking him for his cooperation. By the time it was time to question Melanie Wilson, the detective had gotten another important piece of information. The financial department of North Star Energy had confirmed the fraud. James had indeed received several types of payments to which he was not entitled. Moreover, the investigation into his actions had begun 2 weeks before the murder. although Hunter himself probably didn't know about it. Melanie walked into the interrogation room looking completely crushed. A young woman with dark circles under her eyes and a face swollen with tears. Her hands trembled as she sat down across from the detective. "Miss Wilson," Taylor began softly, "I understand that you're going through a difficult time right now, but I need your help to understand what happened to James." She nodded, looking down at the table. "When was the last time you saw James Hunter?" "Yesterday morning," she answered quietly. "He was leaving for work, said he'd be back for dinner." "And he didn't come back?" "No." She shook her head. "I called him several times, but he didn't answer. I figured he'd been held up in the oil field. It happens sometimes." Taylor scrutinized her face. The grief reflected on it looked genuine, but the same could be said for Ashley. "Miss Wilson, your car was spotted yesterday in the parking lot of the Northern Lights Motel between 1830 and 1920. That's the time James Hunter was murdered." Melanie flinched, staring at the detective with wide eyes. "Yeah," she faltered, then covered her face with her hands and cried, "I didn't mean to do it. I just wanted to talk to him." There was a heavy silence in the room, broken only by her sobs. Taylor gave her time to calm down, then asked softly, "What happened, Melanie?" She wiped her tears with a trembling hand. "I found out the truth a week ago," she said quietly. "I found an email from Ashley on his laptop. It was an accident. He forgot to log out of his email, and I wanted to check mine. At first, I thought it was just an ex-girlfriend, but then I saw the address beloved husband." Melanie took a deep breath. "I started digging, found their wedding photos in his cloud storage, documents proving they'd been married for 6 years, the whole time I'd known him. Turns out he lied to me from the beginning. He said he was divorced, that his ex-wife lived in Seattle." "And you followed him yesterday?" "Yes," she admitted. "I didn't know what to do for days. I didn't want to make a scene at home in front of the baby. Then yesterday I saw him meeting a woman at the motel. I thought it was her, Ashley, so I drove over there." "Then what happened?" "I waited in the car. I saw him walk into the motel. Then I decided to get closer, see what they were talking about. I couldn't hear them through the door, but I could tell she'd just found out the truth too, and that she was pregnant." Melanie wiped away her tears again. "Then James left the room. He saw me in the hallway and just froze. And I was so angry, so humiliated." "Did you have a knife with you?" "Yes," she whispered. "I took it from the house, not to kill him, just to scare him, to make him tell the truth. But when I saw his face, all those emotions just exploded inside me. 3 years of lies, my child growing up in a fake family. I don't even remember stabbing him. I just remember his surprised face, and then the blood. A lot of blood." Taylor listened to her confession with a stony expression, although inside he felt a mixture of pity and professional satisfaction from the solved case. "What happened next?" "I ran away," Melanie said simply. "I went home, put my son to bed, washed the knife, thought no one saw me. And then the cops came and told me James was dead." She looked up at the detective. "What happens to my son now?" "That's for the court to decide," Taylor replied. "Melanie Wilson, you are under arrest on suspicion of the murder of James Hunter." 3 weeks later, Detective Robert Taylor sat in his office in Fairbanks, completing the paperwork on the Hunter case. The case was almost closed. Melanie Wilson had pleaded guilty to murder committed under the influence. Given all the circumstances and the first confession, the prosecutor agreed to a minimum term deal. A financial investigation into North Star Energy revealed the extent of Hunter's machinations. He had illegally received more than $100,000 over 3 years. That money was now frozen and would probably be returned to the company after all legal procedures were completed. There was a knock on the door and Jenkins entered the office. "Detective, you have a visitor." Taylor looked up and saw Ashley Hunter standing in the doorway. She looked better than the last time they'd met, calmer, though still sad. "Mrs. Hunter," Taylor stood up. "What can I do for you?" "I'm flying home tonight," she said. "But before I leave, I wanted to thank you for your work and ask you about James's son." "Ethan is with Melanie's parents right now," the detective answered. "They filed for custody. Apparently, the court is going to side with them." Ashley nodded. That's good. I want the boy to have a family. She put her hand on her belly, which was already noticeably rounded. My baby will know he has a brother when the time comes. How about you? Taylor asked. Getting by, she smiled weakly. Day by day. I'll be back in Seattle, getting ready for the baby, start a new life. Taylor nodded respectfully. This woman had shown remarkable fortitude in a terrible situation. You know, Ashley said quietly, looking out the window, sometimes I think I might have been in Melanie's shoes. If I'd known the truth sooner, if I'd had more time to think about it, who knows how I would have reacted. The detective didn't say anything. He was all too aware of how thin the line between victim and perpetrator was in such emotionally charged situations. Anyway, Ashley straightened up. I'm glad it's over, that the truth is out. Now we can move on. After she left, Taylor stood at the window for a long time, looking out at the snow-covered streets of Fairbanks. James Hunter's story had ended in tragedy, but life went on for those who remained. Two women, deceived by one man, are now bound forever through their children, brothers who will never know their common father. There was no happy ending to this story, the detective thought. Only harsh reality and the consequences of lies that, as always, surfaced when least expected. And yet, in that harsh reality, there was hope, for a new beginning, for healing, for the truth, which, no matter how painful, is always better than the most elaborate lie. Taylor closed Hunter's case file and placed it on the shelf with the other solved cases. Another story completed. New mysteries, new stories of human passion and error awaited him ahead. That was his job, to unravel the complex knots of human destinies, revealing the truth, no matter how unpalatable it was. The detective turned off the lights in his office and walked out, closing the door behind him. It was beginning to snow outside, covering the city with a white blanket, as if trying to cleanse it of all the sins and secrets lurking beneath the surface of ordinary life.